By naming a tiny private driveway something like Royal Oak Court, they can market the surrounding homes as being part of an exclusive enclave rather than just being on a standard suburban road. It is a form of linguistic landscaping where the name does the work that the architecture cannot. But perhaps the most interesting evolution of the vanity address is its role in the global wealth circuit. For the international billionaire class, an address in a global city is a form of currency. They don't buy a house on 57th Street, they buy a unit at 157. The name of the building replaces the name of the street entirely. In this world, the street naming convention has reached its final, most abstract form. The street has disappeared, and all that remains is the brand. As we look at these glass towers and their singular numbers, we see the absolute opposite of William Penn's Quaker logic. Penn wanted numbers to make everyone equal. Modern developers use numbers to make everyone else feel inferior. This tension between equality and exclusivity leads us into our next chapter, where we look at the final frontier of naming, the naming of the void, how we name the suburbs, the sprawl, and the places that have no history at all.
By the late 20th century, the American population was no longer primarily urban. The flight to the suburbs had created a vast, sprawling landscape that required a completely different approach to naming. In the city, the grid was king. In the suburbs, the curve was God. As developers bulldozed millions of acres of forest, farm, and wetland to make room for identical split-level homes, they faced a psychological problem. How do you make a mass-produced environment feel like a unique, storied home? The answer lay in the nostalgic convention, a strategy of naming that used language to provide the nature and history that the bulldozers had just removed. This era gave birth to what critics call the law of the missing landmark. If a subdivision is named Hidden Valley, you can be almost certain the valley has been filled in with concrete. If a street is named Whispering Pines, it is likely that the pines were the first things cut down to make room for the asphalt. The naming of the American sprawl became a form of linguistic taxidermy, where dead landscapes were stuffed and mounted on street signs. Developers realized that homebuyers in the 1980s and 90s were fleeing the coldness of the numbered city, so they offered them an illusion of the pastoral. The naming conventions of the sprawl also introduced the suffix of sophistication. The humble street and avenue were banished as being too urban or gritty. In their place came a flood of new descriptors: circle, court, trace, crossing, landing, and ridge. These words were chosen to imply a specific geography that rarely existed. A court implies a royal enclosure. A landing implies a river that is nowhere to be found. By using these suffixes, developers created a false topography. They were building a brand of American life that felt established and rooted, even if the paint on the houses was still wet. This naming style also relied heavily on thematic clusters. To help residents navigate the maze-like cul-de-sacs, developers would pick a theme and exhaust it. You might live in a neighborhood where every street is a British university: Oxford, Cambridge, Eton, a type of bird, robin, sparrow, hawk, or a Civil War battle, Antietam, Gettysburg, Shiloh. While this provided a sense of order within the chaos of the sprawl, it also created a sense of artificiality. To a visitor, it felt less like a town and more like a movie set. The street names didn't grow out of the land, they were a skim draped over it. However, the sprawl's naming convention served a very practical purpose in the age of the car: speed reading. Because suburban streets are often winding and lack landmarks, the names had to be distinct enough to be recognized at 30 miles per hour. A numbered grid doesn't work well when streets aren't straight, so the distinctive name became the primary navigation tool.
But because there are only so many Pleasant Oaks in one county, this led to increasingly bizarre and long-winded names. We started seeing addresses like Old Heritage Plantation Boulevard, a mouthful that attempted to pack as much perceived history as possible into a single sign. The sprawl's illusion represents the final decoupling of the name from the reality. In the medieval world, a street name was an honest description. In the American suburb, the street name is an aspiration. It is a promise of a quiet, natural life that the very existence of the suburb makes impossible. As we move toward the final chapters of our story, we will see how this imaginary geography is being challenged by a new generation of planners who want to bring honesty back to the map. As the 21st century progressed, a sense of placelessness began to haunt the American psyche. People realized that living at the intersection of bird-themed Street A and bird-themed Street B in a nameless suburb felt hollow. This realization sparked a movement known as New Urbanism. Architects and planners like Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg and Andres Duany began to argue that the sprawl's illusion was a failure. They wanted to return to the human scale, to the walkable, dense, and meaningful streetscapes of the pre-car era. But to do this, they had to rethink the naming convention from the ground up. The New Urbanist convention is a restorative approach. It rejects the marketing fluff of the sprawl and the cold mathematics of the grid in favor of civic memory. In towns like Seaside, Florida, or Celebration, Florida, the street names were chosen to evoke the classic American small town of the early 20th century. You see a return to simple, sturdy names: Main Street, Market Street, Broad Street, and Central Square. These aren't just names, they are functional anchors. By calling a street Market Street, the planners are signaling that this is a place where commerce should happen, even if the shops haven't been built yet. It is an attempt to use naming to engineer a social life. One of the key innovations of this era is the historical salvage. Before breaking ground, new urbanist developers often hire local historians to dig through archives. They look for the names of the farmers who owned the land in 1850, the types of crops that were grown, or the forgotten names of local creeks. These found names are then applied to the new streets. This is different from the sprawl's illusion because it isn't made up. It's an attempt to reattach the modern resident to the actual soil. If you live on Horton Way, and Horton was the man who plowed that field a century ago, you feel a thin but real thread of continuity with the past. However, new urbanism also introduced a new kind of aesthetic control. In these highly planned communities, the street signs themselves are part of the architecture. Gone are the standardized green and white federal signs. In their place are bespoke markers, wrought iron, carved wood, or gas lamp posts. The name is treated as a graphic design element. This reflects a shift in how Americans view their streets, no longer as public infrastructure, but as shared outdoor living rooms. The name is the wallpaper of the community, designed to make the resident feel at home the moment they turn the corner. But this movement faces a significant critique, the Disneyfication of geography. Critics argued that by trying to build soul through naming and architecture, new urbanists are creating elite enclaves that feel like theme parks. When you name a street Unity Way in a gated community that is 95% wealthy and homogeneous, the name feels like a cynical joke to those on the outside. The Main Street soul they are trying to bring back was originally organic and messy. When it is managed by a developer's board, the names can feel like costume jewelry, shiny and pretty, but lacking the weight of real history. Despite this, new urbanism has successfully challenged the asphalt empire. It has proven that people are hungry for names that mean something. It has forced the modern surveyor to put down the calculator and pick up the history book. As we move toward the final chapters, we will see how this hunger for meaningful names is being taken even further by the indigenous mapping movement, a radical attempt to peel back the layers of colonial naming and see what lies beneath the very first streets of America.
For nearly 4 centuries, the American map has been a European document. From the King Streets of the colonial era to the Washington Avenues of the Republic, the names on our signs have told a story of arrival, conquest, and settlement. But in the last few decades, a radical movement has begun to decolonize the American streetscape. Historians, activists, and indigenous leaders are pointing out that the New World wasn't new at all, and the first streets were actually ancient trails that had names long before English or Dutch ever touched the soil. This is the era of the indigenous layer, where the goal is to peel back the colonial sticker to reveal the original geography beneath. In many major U.S. cities, the most famous thoroughfares are actually ghost trails. Broadway in Manhattan was originally the Wickwaskeck Trail, a path used by the Lenape people to traverse the island's ridgeline. In Chicago, many of the diagonal streets that break the city's rigid grid, like Milwaukee Avenue, were originally Native American portage paths. For centuries, these origins were ignored or suppressed by the numerical convention. By turning a trail into Route 41 or 14th Street, the state was effectively erasing the memory of the people who first mapped the land. The movement today is about restoring those names to the public consciousness. This restorative convention is manifesting in 2 ways: dual naming and total reclamation. In cities like Seattle, itself named after a Suquamish and Duwamish chief, there are increasing efforts to install bilingual street signs that feature both the English name and the original Coast Salish name. This isn't just a symbolic gesture, it is a spatial intervention. It forces every commuter and tourist to acknowledge that they are walking through a layered history. In places like Santa Fe or Anchorage, these dual language signs serve as a daily reminder that the American grid is merely a recent addition to a very old world. However, the process is fraught with linguistic complexity. Many indigenous languages were oral and did not have a standardized written form that fits easily onto a modern, reflective green street sign. There is also the challenge of pronunciation politics. When a city renames a street using a traditional indigenous word, it often faces pushback from residents who find the name difficult to say. This highlights a deep-seated cultural bias. Americans are comfortable with difficult French names like Des Plaines or New Orleans, but often balk at names that reflect the continent's own original heritage. This resistance is the final frontier of the renaming wars. Reclaiming the indigenous layer also challenges the very concept of the property-based name. Most Western naming conventions are about ownership, who bought the land or who rules it. Indigenous naming was often relational, describing the street's relationship to a river, a seasonal migration, or a sacred site. By bringing these names back, planners are introducing a more ecological way of thinking about the city. It shifts the street from being a real estate asset back to being a living connection to the environment. As we move toward the final chapters of our journey, we see that the American map is becoming a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written on, erased, and rewritten many times. The indigenous layer is perhaps the most important rewrite of all, because it challenges the foundational myths of the American grid. It reminds us that before there were numbers and before there were kings, there were stories that defined the land. In the next chapter, we will look at how the common person, the ordinary citizen, is finally getting their chance to write their own stories onto the corners of the world through the People's Convention. For the vast majority of human history, the power to name a street was held by the few, the kings, the commissioners, the developers, or the postal bureaucrats.
The average person, who actually walked the pavement and lived in the houses, had almost zero say in the linguistic identity of their own front door. However, the 21st century has brought about a democratic shift that is slowly dismantling the top-down hierarchy of urban planning. This is the era of the People's Convention, where crowdsourcing and participatory budgeting are allowing ordinary citizens to take the pen and write their own names onto the map. This movement began as a reaction against the blandification we discussed in earlier chapters. Residents in cities like Portland, Oregon, and Austin, Texas, grew tired of living in neighborhoods that felt like they were designed by a corporate committee in a different state. They began to demand naming rights as a form of civic engagement. Today, many American municipalities have established formal processes where new streets in a development aren't named by the developer alone, but through a public Name That Street contest or a neighborhood vote. This has led to a surge in hyper-whimsical and locally significant names that a bureaucrat would never have considered. Names like Electric Avenue, Bowie Boulevard, or streets named after local high school teachers and beloved librarians. The People's Convention is also being driven by the digital democracy of social media. In the past, if you wanted to protest a street name, you had to physically go to City Hall and hope for a 3-minute speaking slot. Now, a viral petition or a well-organized Twitter campaign can force a city council's hand in a matter of days. We are seeing a rapid response naming phenomenon. For example, when a local hero passes away or a significant cultural event occurs, the community can mobilize to have a street renamed almost in real time. This turns the street map into a living news feed of the community's current values and passions. However, this democratization introduces a new challenge, the Bodie McBoatface risk. When you give the public the power to name things, you don't always get Lincoln or Jefferson. You sometimes get Pizza Street or names based on fleeting internet memes. City planners often find themselves in a tug-of-war with the public, trying to balance community expression with long-term dignity. To manage this, many cities have created naming criteria that require a name to have historical relevance or geographical logic. But the definition of relevance is increasingly being dictated by the residents rather than the experts. Another fascinating aspect of the People's Convention is the rise of commemorative crowdfunding. In some jurisdictions, if a community wants to rename a street, but the city claims it doesn't have the budget for the new signage and legal updates, the community raises the money themselves through platforms like GoFundMe. This has effectively turned street naming into a subscription model of civic pride. If you care enough about a name, you can literally buy its place on the map. This levels the playing field for lower-income neighborhoods that were previously ignored by the commemorative convention because they lacked political lobbyists. As we move toward the final 2 chapters, we are seeing the American map become more colorful, more eccentric, and more reflective of the common man. The mathematical cage of the 1811 grid is still there, but the people are decorating the bars of that cage with their own stories. But as the map becomes more crowded with human emotion and public opinion, a new question arises. In a world where everyone wants their name on a sign, what happens when we run out of corners?
As we move deeper into the 21st century, the very definition of a street is beginning to dissolve. For thousands of years, street naming was a 2-dimensional task. It was a flat map laid over the earth. But the modern American city is no longer flat. It is a soaring, multi-layered environment of sky bridges, underground tunnels, and streets in the air. This has forced a radical evolution in naming conventions, the 3D convention. We are no longer just naming paths, we are naming volumes. In cities like Chicago and Minneapolis, where weather or density has pushed pedestrian life away from the ground, the naming of these vertical and subterranean paths has created a new invisible geography.
In Chicago, the multi-level street system, where Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue have upper, middle, and lower layers, is a logistical marvel and a naming nightmare. To a GPS or a 19th century grid system, these are the same coordinate. But to a human being on upper Wacker versus lower Wacker is the difference between a sunny boulevard and a dark industrial tunnel. This has necessitated the sub-suffix, a new layer of naming that the original commissioners of 1811 could never have imagined. We are seeing the z-axis of the map become as important as the x and y. But the most profound shift is the move into the virtual sphere. As we discussed with Google Maps, the digital twin of the city is becoming more important than the physical one. But now, we are seeing the rise of virtual-only streets. In the burgeoning world of smart cities, planners are creating digital delivery corridors, paths designated only for drones and autonomous delivery robots. These paths don't have physical signs, but they have names in the code. We are entering an era of augmented naming, where a street might be named Main Street for humans, but Drone Corridor Delta 9 for the machines overhead. This creates a split reality on the map, one name for our hearts and history, and another for the algorithms that keep the city running. This 3D expansion also includes the interior street. In massive mixed-use developments and megastructures, the line between a public street and a private hallway is blurring. These buildings are so large they require their own internal naming conventions. We see internal avenues and vertical plazas that function exactly like public streets, but are entirely contained within a single glass and steel envelope. This represents the ultimate privatization of the convention. If a developer can name the internal streets of a 100-story building, they are creating a private world where the public city council has no jurisdiction. The common ground that William Penn envisioned is being pulled off the earth and tucked away into private clouds. Furthermore, the rise of virtual reality, or VR, and the metaverse has introduced the concept of infinite naming. In digital worlds, there is no scarcity of land. You can build 1,000,000 Fifth Avenues. This has led to a strange digital nostalgia, where virtual developers are recreating historic American streetscapes that no longer exist in the real world. You can walk down a digital version of Old Broadway from 1890 or a cyberpunk Main Street. Here, naming isn't about navigation at all. It's about curation. The street name becomes a skin that tells you which era or fantasy you are currently inhabiting. As we look up at the skyscrapers and down into the digital code, we realize that the street naming convention is becoming a multi-dimensional puzzle. We are trying to map a world that is moving too fast for metal signs to keep up. In our final chapter, we will bring it all together, looking at the future of the sign and asking, in a world of AI, drones, and total digital immersion, will the humble street name survive at all? Or are we witnessing the end of the written map? We have traveled from the muddy bread streets of medieval London to the numerical cages of Manhattan and through the renaming wars of the civil rights era. Now we stand at the threshold of a world that may no longer need street names at all. As we look toward the mid-21st century, the history of street naming conventions is reaching a strange and silent climax. We are entering the era of post-linguistic navigation. In a world dominated by artificial intelligence, augmented reality, and autonomous systems, the human habit of naming the earth is being replaced by the machine habit of calculating it. The first sign of this end of the map is the rise of global positioning codes. Systems like What3 Words have already divided the entire planet into 3-meter squares, each assigned a random 3-word address, like apple.chair.desk. These codes are far more precise than any street name could ever be. For a delivery drone or an autonomous Tesla, 123 Main Street is a fuzzy, imprecise concept. It could be the front door, the driveway, or the mailbox, but a coordinate code is absolute. As these systems become the backbone of our economy, the name on the green metal sign becomes a decorative relic, a piece of vintage tech maintained only for human nostalgia. We are also seeing the rise of haptic and audio navigation. In the near future, you won't need to look at a street sign to know where to turn. Your smart glasses will project a glowing digital ribbon on the pavement, or your hearables will whisper directions directly into your ear based on your biometric data. In this frictionless world, the linguistic identity of the street fades into the background. When the technology is perfect, you don't need to know the name of the road to reach your destination. You only need to trust the algorithm. This represents a profound loss of geographic literacy. If we stop reading the names of our streets, we stop reading the history of our cities. However, there is a counterforce at play, the human need for narrative. Even if we don't need street names for navigation, we still need them for belonging. A computer may see a coordinate, but a human sees a home. This is why we are seeing a resurgence in artistic naming, streets being treated as public poetry or memorial spaces. In the future, street names may move away from being functional tools and become cultural heritage sites. We might see historical augmented reality, where as you walk down a street, your phone displays the various names that street has held over the last 400 years, allowing you to choose which layer of history you want to inhabit. The end of the map isn't necessarily a funeral, it is a transformation. The street name is evolving from a direction into a destination. In the smart city, the numbers and grids will handle the logistics of moving bodies and packages, while the names will be reserved for the places where we pause, the plazas, the parks, and the social corners. We are returning in a full circle to the organic roots of the past, where names were about the spirit of the place rather than the logic of the grid. As we conclude this 20-chapter journey, look at the street sign outside your window. It is more than just metal and paint. It is a treaty signed between the past and the present. It is a record of who won, who lost, what we valued, and what we were afraid to forget. Whether that sign is replaced by a digital pulse or a 3-word code, the impulse that created it, the human desire to say, "I am here and this place has a name," will never truly disappear. The map is changing, but the story of the street is just beginning its next chapter.
Imagine waking up in a world where every corner looks the same. No Broadway, no Sunset Boulevard, no Fifth Avenue. You were lost in a sea of nameless stone and dirt. For most of human history, this was the reality. But as cities grew, so did the need for order. And with order came the ultimate tool of control, the name. From the muddy alleys of medieval London to the neon-soaked grids of Manhattan, the way we name our streets tells the secret story of who we are, who we fear, and who we want to be remembered as. This is the hidden history of the world, one block at a time. Before there were maps in our pockets or GPS satellites orbiting the Earth, there was the descriptive era. In the earliest days of urban civilization, think 12th century London, Paris, or Rome, street naming wasn't a government project. It was a democratic, organic process born out of pure necessity. If you told a friend to meet you, you couldn't give them a number or a formal title. You had to describe the world as it was. Streets were named based on what people smelled, saw, or did there. This created a visceral, often gritty, linguistic map of the city. If a street was home to the city's bakers, it became Baker Street. If it was a place where fish was sold, it was Fishmonger Lane. In these early days, a street name was a functional tool for survival. You knew exactly where to go to find a blacksmith or a cobbler because the street literally told you. However, this organic naming had a darker, more honest side that would shock modern sensibilities. Medieval residents were blunt. If a street was notoriously muddy and filled with filth, they didn't call it Oak Garden Drive.
They called it Dirt Lane, or worse. In London, there were streets named after the specific types of waste dumped there, and even streets named after the ladies of the night who frequented them. These names weren't official, they were common usage. They were the nicknames that stuck because they were true. As these settlements grew from villages into bustling hubs of trade, the lack of a central system began to create chaos. A traveler from a neighboring town wouldn't know the local nicknames. Merchants began to realize that the identity of a street was tied to its commerce. The descriptive era was the first time humans realized that a name could define a space. But as kings and emperors began to look down at their sprawling, messy capitals, they saw something they didn't like, a map they didn't control.